This is the Sex and Censorship podcast. Welcome back to the Sex and Censorship podcast. You can find us at sexandcensorship.org, Porn Panic on Twitter, Sex and Censorship on Facebook. There's now a YouTube channel, which I keep forgetting to mention, so go and find the Sex and Censorship YouTube channel, and you can find all of the old podcasts there, or most of the old podcasts there, up on the YouTube channel. There's also going to be some videos to come, so go and subscribe and don't miss out on that. I'm recording this week with the sniffles, so if you admire my strength and bravery in the face of adversity, then please go to the Sex and Censorship blog, sexandcensorship.org, and make a donation, or you can show your support by buying my book, Porn Panic, which is available at Amazon and Waterstones and pretty much everywhere else in the world. So this week's podcast is a recording made at Birmingham Salon, which is a discussion and debating group in Birmingham, you might have guessed. I went up there to debate on the subject of pornography against Luke Gittos, who is the legal editor at Spiked Online. And this podcast, excuse me, told you I was ill. This podcast is simply contains my speech, which is about 15 minutes, followed by Luke's speech. It doesn't contain any of the ensuing debate, which was very interesting. And if you're in Birmingham, go and check out Birmingham Salon. They hold some really good and interesting discussions. So without further ado, here is the recording, beginning with me.
Right, good evening everyone. Welcome to Birmingham Salon. My name's Rosie Pocklington. I'm a salon regular. Porn, is it ever liberating? Now we've got our two speakers. We've got Jerry Barnett. He's an IT specialist and political activist, and he's just published his book, Porn Panic, which looks at freedom of speech and pornography. Really good read. There'll be some for sale at the end of the evening. And our other speaker is Luke Gittos, who is a criminal lawyer, and he's the legal editor of Spiked Online, which is a pro-free speech publication. And I'll ask Jerry to begin.
Thanks. First of all, I've come down with a slight lurgy today, so my voice might be a bit weak, and that's also a plea to that my arguments would have been at least 50% better if I was feeling okay. But yeah, just a bit background on myself, because I think my background is very relevant to this. I became a technologist in the 1980s, got very early involvement with software engineering and the internet before most people had heard of those things. Ended up by chance building one of the first commercial porn sites in the world in 1995, and I've been in and around that industry for about the last 20 years in some way, shape or form. On the other side, I've also been a political activist since the late 70s, early 80s. I was involved in anti-racism, anti-fascism, and eventually those two threads of my life have combined, so the politics and the porn technology. And so to an extent my book is about those two things, and the book isn't just about porn. It's in part it's about fascism, and it's a look at a subject that's always fascinated me from a very different angle. So in 2012 I closed down the business I ran. It was a software stroke porn business. The porn industry, you may all be pleased to know, is pretty much dead. And it ate itself, like so many industries do these days, by making its product cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until it was basically anyone could make it and anyone could publish it and anyone could watch it, and it's become free. And from the point of view of someone who ran a porn company, that was quite sad. And from the point of view of someone who believes in sexual freedom, free expression and so on, that's a fantastic thing. So I think the free availability of sexual material is one of the great things that's come about as a result of the internet, and I'm very much a defender of it. So it's kind of become common to say that porn is the canary in the coal mine of free speech or of liberty, and I think that's true. My book documents, starting about a decade ago, small groups that went and picketed strip clubs and went and tried and began lobbying to get porn censored and this kind of thing. And that's really what got me back into politics. And those small groups, as I watched more closely, were really the kind of the forerunners of very kind of fascistic political movements that have followed things like what's now called the regressive left, and this kind of thing. So being involved in porn kind of gave me an early insight to what I believe is the rise of a new fascism in society. And let's not forget, throughout history there have been repeated explosions of sexual expression. This goes right back to cave paintings, it goes back to ceramics, early ceramics and early stone carving. And there's a chapter in my book called 40,000 Years of Porn. It turns out that every time humans have invented something, a new way of expressing themselves, and this has happened repeatedly throughout history, pretty much the first thing they think of doing with it is sex. So some of the first cave paintings are very sexual. There are ceramics lying around from 40,000 years ago that are obviously very sexual, and this carries on through to the invention of film, of video, and of course of the internet and photography. And as I say, pretty much every art form, the first thing humans have done with it, being humans and being that we are sexual beings and that sex is actually absolutely fundamental to our nature, is kind of, let's see if we can draw a pair of tips with that. And porn and politics have gone hand in hand through the ages, and for every upswing in sexual expression, so you get a development in technology, an upswing in sexual expression, and then a backlash, and these kind of cycles have repeated and repeated throughout history. So, for example, there was an exhibition at the British Museum of erotic sculpture a couple of years ago, and I listened to an interview with the curator, and he was asked, why are all the figures male? Where are all the female figures? And he said, we just can't, there just don't seem to be any left. And what he's talking about is that the aftermath, there was female erotica in Roman times. In fact, female erotica has always been more valuable than male erotica for very deep biological reasons. But it was mostly smashed, or it was locked away in Vatican vaults. So, time and time again, we've had sexual revolution and sexual backlash. And the sexual revolution, the latest one, came in the mid-90s with the rise of the web. And obviously, the only thing people could think of to do with the early web was to put porn on it. Down to about 10 years ago when the backlash started. And the backlash is really in full swing now. So from smashing statues to burning erotic imagery to now today attempts to censor the internet using pornography, and unfortunately Britain is at the forefront of internet censorship, at least for democratic countries. And the first sites that are blocked on the internet, which is probably going to happen in the next year or two, are going to be porn sites. And then when they've practiced and rehearsed their censorship methods on porn, then it will extend everywhere. So porn isn't the reason for the censorship, it's the excuse for the censorship. So yeah, to an extent I realised we're in this interesting cycle that's been going on throughout history. Now, I've done a lot of porn debates over the years, and they've evolved hugely. So the first one I did was in Ireland at a university about 10 years ago, and it was against a priest and a rabbi, and it was a really easy debate to deal with, because it's either you believe in God and that God hates porn, or you or you don't. And so that was easy. Since then, largely my debates have been against anti-porn feminists, or some would refer to as anti-sex feminists, and those debates become more complex. The anti-porn feminism it was born in the 1980s, and it was a strange development out of what had been a progressive movement, and so anti-porn feminists worked along with the Reagan administration to try and rein in pornography, and it was really, I think, one of the early examples of the modern left taking on very regressive values, and anti-porn feminists kind of have their arguments have developed. They've evolved. So the very first arguments were that women are being horribly abused on porn sets. And this argument comes up time and time again. Mary Whitehouse used to make this argument when she was the leading anti-porn proponent. And now anti-porn feminists make these arguments, and I've heard them over and over again. And they're always anecdotes of nameless people who can't be named, but terrible things have happened to them. And I can't name her because obviously it's confidential. The problem is that none of these cases ever reach the police, none of them ever come to court, nobody ever gets arrested. And just to give an example, the last debate I did a debate at Cambridge Union a few months ago, and a lawyer stood up, an American lawyer, who said she supports porn stars who have exited this evil, horrible industry. And last week, a woman came to me and she had green pus leaking from her vagina because she'd been horribly blah, blah. And anyone who understands the way the porn industry works would know that this is bollocks, basically. I mean, porn stars are probably the most rigorously sexually tested people in the world. I mean, if you don't want to catch an STI, have unprotected sex with a porn star. If they're tested, they cannot work if they're not tested. They have to be tested within the last 3 to 4 weeks. And they're very aware of their sexual health. In the UK, the NHS knows porn stars and understands the industry very well and supports them and gives them free testing, and understands that they have to have a certificate that's less than 4 weeks old to work. And the obvious question anyway is, why would someone who has green pus leaking out of her vagina go and see a lawyer rather than a doctor? But these are the kind of arguments that come up, and these arguments, they're based on anecdotes, and they never seem to involve real people. I wrote a letter to a leading anti-porn feminist group, Object, in the UK, saying, look, if all this stuff that you're talking about is actually happening, and you know of all these cases that you mention over and over again in debates, come to me, we'll try and identify the performers, I'll help you identify the studios, and let's go to the police and report all this stuff that's happening. And of course they didn't reply. This stuff never goes to the police because it's not real. And they kind of dropped that stuff, and then they moved on to much more vague claims of harm to the viewer. So you have words surfacing like objectification, sexualization, porn addiction. So the idea that it's the viewer that's harmed, and then by being harmed, the viewer then goes on to harm women and children. It's always women and children, which of course is, the conservative, the ultimate kind of conservative kind of grouping that needs protection from horrible men. The problem is that there isn't very much evidence to back any of this stuff. There's a simple fact, and I can run through the evidence, but I probably won't have time, at least initially. There's a simple fact that people find it difficult to believe. There's been a lot of research into porn since about 1969, when President Johnson ordered a commission to investigate the harms of porn. And the simple fact is that the rises in porn in society statistically correlate with very steep declines in sexual violence, and this has happened over and over again in different parts of the world. Now, that's not claiming that porn is responsible for that decline, but this pattern has been seen over and over again. The problem is that if all this objectification and degradation of women and sexualization was being caused by porn, you wouldn't expect to see that pattern. You'd expect to see the reverse. And so these days I go to debates where people say, well, obviously there isn't evidence that directly that porn causes men to be horrible brutes, but do we really want our children, our teenagers, to be watching this stuff, really? And the question is, either you've got evidence this is harmful for teenagers, or you haven't. And the evidence appears to be that, very simply, that porn does correlate with declines in sexual violence, and actually it correlates most strongly with declines in sexual violence in the 15 to 19-year-old age group, which is the age group where most sexual violence occurs. People find this difficult to talk about because there's been so much, this is why I named the book Porn Panic. I go on radio programs and no one, the presenter goes, "Oh, come on, you can." This is the fact of 50 years of research, and these are the statistical correlations. In terms of, I think the debate question, can porn ever be liberating? I mean, absolutely. I've met many people in the industry. I know many performers. I know many producers. Many performers become producers, and anecdotally, then people experience more confidence, better body image, and so on. Again, that's quite a natural thing. If you forget the porn panic, the idea that someone might actually get a positive body image feedback from knowing that people look at her on screen and find her sexy and attractive, that doesn't seem to be such a long reach. But I know in this debate, so I'm not sure quite how long I've talked for.
Yeah. Wrap it up.
Okay, just a couple of minutes to wrap up, because I know this debate is quite different, and I know I believe I've read Brendan O'Neill's column in Spite, and I don't know what Luke's going to say, but I believe it's going to be on kind of similar kind of lines. The idea that porn is causing a crisis of intimacy, and that in general there's a crisis of intimacy in society. I very much dispute that. Porn is little, the evidence suggests that it's causing a steep decline in sexual violence, or at least it's part of a change in society that's causing a steep decline in sexual violence. You can't pin it on porn because so many things are changing in society. We are also having less sex than we used to. There has been a decline in the amount of sex people are having. However, I wouldn't say that is that correlates to a decline in intimacy. The fact is that there are, if you excuse the language, back in primitive times, men spent most of their time fucking and fighting, and that's kind of what being male is about, without any distractions. And it's not just porn that distracts us from this. It's books and TV and computer games and art, and every invention of the modern era distracts us from our basic human instincts, and we're having less sex because we have other things to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think, as Brendan O'Neill claimed, that there is a crisis of intimacy. I think we're becoming more social, we're becoming more intimate, we're becoming more loving as people. There are political crises, undoubtedly, but I think the human race is... You're telling me to shut up now. Okay, I'll shut up now, thank you.
Okay, fine. Luke, like to...
Okay, I'm going to make what is today quite a controversial case that porn is in general a bad thing, and that when people use it, they should be ashamed, and that we should do it in private, continue to do it in private, and feel a little bit embarrassed about the fact that we do it. One thing I want to question is this idea that porn is dead, because anyone who lives in the modern world knows that porn is not dead. Porn is a bigger part of our lives than it ever has been before. You can barely turn around any corner of popular culture without experiencing some aspect of pornography. You're right that it's become that sort of small porn companies might be going out of business. That's precisely because all the major porn websites have become so abundant and so cheap, free to access, that you now no longer have to pay for niche providers to get your rocks off. You can access it almost immediately on most on enormous websites, free of charge. So the idea that porn is dead, I think, is absolutely the opposite, which is exactly why I think we're in the opposite of what Jerry talks about. The idea that we're in the midst of a porn panic, I think, is completely wrong. We're in the midst of the shift from porn, from the sort of outreaches of society, from the niches of society, into a kind of mainstream acceptance. It's become almost a part of mainstream sexuality. It's become a normal part of how we talk about sex. It's become almost interchangeable with our contemporary sex lives. And I think that any society that values sex and values relationships should recognise that the intrusion of what is essentially self-indulgence onto a sphere that used to be about intimacy and relationships is a real problem. Also, I think, just to come back directly on some of what Jerry said, I mean, porn today is not erotic art. I mean, Jerry professes to have been involved in porn, but if you looked at any porn recently, this is not art that we're talking about. This is something functional. It's strictly functional. It's something to facilitate someone being able to masturbate and come quicker than they usually would. I mean, to pretend that this is of any aesthetic value whatsoever, I think, is to really ignore the reality of what we're talking about. And it's precisely the fact of porn as being something which is directly related to self-fulfillment in a very brisk, sort of self-indulged way, which I think does create a degree of harm and does create a degree of impact on society which is not wholly positive. I'm very broadly sceptical of psychological research into this sort of thing, but looking into this in the lead up to this debate, there is some relatively sound research that if someone watches porn in a relationship, it's going to cause some problems in that relationship. And I sort of think that's understandable. You know, if your partner, who you share sexual relationships with, is going off and, to your knowledge, beating themselves off over someone else, I think that's bound to create a degree of tension. I think it's perfect. You don't need an academic to tell you that if someone is fully open and confident about their use of porn, it might well fracture the kind of intimate relationship that you have with that person. And I don't even think we need academic research to tell us that that's a thing. Anyone who's in a relationship would know that if their partner is going behind their back to look at pornography, it might well cause a degree of harm and a degree of a problem. So I agree entirely with Jerry that the usual arguments that are made against pornography by the anti-sex feminists of the 60s and 70s were completely wrong. There is absolutely, by the way, Jerry, no causative relation between the use of pornography and sexual violence. And by the way, that works the other way, as you hinted at and then retreated from. I mean, the idea that pornography is, that access to pornography is somehow preventing sexual violence is just as ludicrous and just as mad as the idea that pornography somehow causes sexual violence. There is no connection between these two things. So that's just to come back a bit on what Jerry said. And I think I've got a question for you, Jerry, a direct one, which follows on to a lot of my conversations with people who pro-porn, propagandists, campaigners or whatever. And that is, what's the positive case for pornography? Because having read the book, I'm not clear on exactly what the positive case for it is. I can understand why it's not as bad as some people say, but I don't know what the positive case for it is. Because when it comes down to it, it really is a moment of self-indulgence, pure self-indulgence, and pure self-pleasure. Usually, I would expect at the expense of your interactions with other people, I think. So if you could just give me an idea of what the positive case for pornography is, then I think that would be helpful. I've just got 3 brief points to make about why we should think about pornography in a slightly different way to maybe some of the anti-sex feminists, but also some of the pro-porn people tend to talk about it. Firstly, I think we need to situate it in a context, which is how society views sex and relationships today in the current moment. And then ask, well, what's changed about the way we view sex and relationships in the current moment? And why is it that we've had this enormous influx of pornography into mainstream culture? And then, thirdly, question and critique porn's role in our contemporary discussion. So they're the 3 things I'd like to do, if I can, in my remaining time. So, what's the context of this explosion of pornography into the mainstream? Well, Brendan O'Neill's not here, but I wrote my book about rape and sexual violence about a year ago. And in connection with that book, I read a lot of academic sociology around the question of what people call intimacy, or the intimate sphere. And I started to ask questions about, there's this really pressing question in academic sociology that I wasn't aware of before I started this reading, which was, what exactly is it that gives relationships and sex meaning in today's climate? What is it that gives our romantic interactions with other people, their meaning and content. And there's an awful lot of writing about this. There's a sociologist called Anthony Giddens who wrote in around the mid-1990s that society is faced with this problem, that sex has become freed from what he calls the bonds of reproduction. People are a lot more free in the contemporary setting to have sex on their own terms. They're not having sex just to have babies, that much is obvious. They're not even having sex in order to maintain a marital relationship. They're a lot more free to go out and have sex outside of marriage. They're a lot more free to have sex in the way that they enjoy having sex. So then, what is it that gives that action, that act, of which, of course, for many centuries previously has had all sorts of different meanings at different times, what is it that gives it that meaning in the present day? And I think that's the kind of question we have to ask, because I think it's a question that society is fundamentally, at the moment, failing to answer. And what I see, rather than a porn panic, I really see a panic around the meaning of sex and relationships. And I see the only real, whenever you look up commentary around sex and relationships today, almost inevitably what you'll find is reams and reams of warnings, educative material, new laws, and episodes of The Archers, which are all about how dangerous intimate relationships are. And I think we're entering a time where the only narrative that we are happy exploring in contemporary times about relationships and sex is one based on a narrative of fear. So one example of this is the explosion of risk-averse narratives around sex amongst students. I mean, it's the most obvious forum in which this occurs. I mean, on campuses at the moment, the very first thing you learn when you get to university is how to properly approach someone and ask them to have sex with you in order to avoid a rape allegation or an allegation of sexual assault. But these students are merely reflecting the kind of narratives that have evolved around sex and relationships in the wider world. You know, the idea that obsessive or passionate behaviour has become increasingly, I think, pathologized over the last 5 years. In fact, it's now a criminal offence to act in a controlling way over your intimate partner. I mean, most of you won't know that because the police would never arrest you for it. But it's part and parcel of this, of a legislative attempt to intervene in overly controlling or intimate relationships. So you have this increasing pathologization of passionate behaviour, especially targeted, by the way, at the young. If you remember, in 2010, the government expanded the definition of domestic violence so that they could include young people's relationships with people of 16, 17, 18, because it was thought that teenagers who got involved in overly intimate relationships were at risk of seriously emotionally and later possibly physically harming one another. So it was thought that the expansion of the definition of domestic violence to include emotional harm would not only intervene in those relationships in the adult world, which were seen to be too obsessive, too controlling, too passionate, but would also be able to intervene in young people's relationships at an earlier stage. And I think you see this pathologization of intimacy and of sex playing out in what Jerry's hinted at about millennials' attitudes to sex. So we know that more millennials now, people who were born and came of age around 2000, a bigger portion of them are having no sex at all. They're having less sex overall than generations that have gone before them. And those that are having sex are having far more promiscuous sex. So they're going out and sleeping with lots and lots of different people. And in fact, if you look up, millennials' attitudes to sex, what you will find is the term hookup culture, the idea that they will go out and basically sleep with anyone because they've got Tinder or whatever on their phone. And what I think this sort of is interesting. I think it plays into the same plays into some of the same characteristics of the contemporary moment that the porn obsession does. The millennials that are having sex are basically having risk-free sex, or at least free of emotional risk. They're having sex in a way which is detached, unengaged. Slavoj Žižek, a philosopher who I have very little in common with, had a wonderful way of describing Tinder, and he called it falling in love without the fall. And what he meant was Tinder is sort of the way of getting to the point of having a romantic relationship without actually having to risk anything of yourself, without having to risk any emotional involvement or any emotional connection with another human being. So actually I think the kind of millennial obsession with promiscuousness and the fact that fewer and fewer of them are having sex and that the fewer and fewer of them are, and people are having less sex than they were before, coincides very nicely with this obsession with pornography. Because pornography and promiscuousness, I think, are two sides of the same retreat. They're two sides of the same retreat from the kind of emotional vulnerability that genuine intimacy and genuine sexual relations bring with them. So that's what I think is playing into the explosive rise of pornography. The idea that we're in a porn panic, I think, is completely wrong-headed. We're in fact in a moment of porn popularisation, porn being driven into the mainstream. And I think that coincides very nicely with millennial attitudes to sex, which is effectively that it's meaningless, relatively promiscuous, and all about self-fulfillment. How long have I got? Have I got more time?
Well, if you...
Okay, good. I'll speed through.
Yeah.
So what's changed? So the problem is that the way I see this progressing is that in the 1960s, you have a sexual revolution whereby Victorian attitudes that pervaded in the 1950s are broken apart by people who are embracing sexual liberation. The development of first and second wave feminism, meaning that women were more confident in asserting their sexual individuality, and the emergence of individuals treating their sex life as part of their identity and part of their personhood. I think that comes to a shuddering halt in the 1980s, where we have the most important sex-based panic of the last 30 or 40 years, which was around AIDS and around HIV. And I think the panic around HIV and AIDS was a classic moral panic. Jerry talks about moral panics in his book, but there is a blind spot, I think, over the HIV/AIDS panic, which effectively attempted to reconstitute the Victorian values of the past in the face of a new promiscuousness, and particularly among gay men who are conceived of as a particularly promiscuous group in society. So the idea was that, and people now look on the HIV panic as an archetypal moral panic of our time. It was a moral panic targeted at a select group of people, mostly gay men, who are perceived to be the most promiscuous in society. And it was a means of generating panic and concern about sex and about risk, about intimate interaction with other human beings. And I think we're now seeing a resurgence of that panic, not about pornography, but about sex. I think we're seeing a resurgence of that same panic about genuine, unregulated, intimate relationships between people. And I think that's why you actually see a lot of the echoes of the sentiments that were around at the time of the HIV/AIDS panic. You see a resurgence of the safe sex awareness stuff, which, the NUS, the first thing you'll see, as well as having a consent class, would be you'll be deluged with condoms the moment you walk through the door. The idea that sex is, I think the panic that we have around rape and sexual violence is in many ways a sort of inverse vision of the HIV/AIDS panic. The idea that sex is risky, that it threatens something fundamental about yourself, that you should not do it unless you're absolutely certain of the parameters in which it's taking place. I think a lot of the old Victorian attitudes that were encouraged in the course of the HIV/AIDS panic have now been reconstituted, not in the context of a panic around porn, but a panic around sex and relationships, which is why I think, although I agree with a lot of what Jerry says about censorship and about the internet, I think he misses the mark when he identifies the panic as around porn. And I think the important thing is to identify it as a reconstituted panic which has been present in society before around sex and relationships. So then, just to briefly conclude in 2 or 3 sentences about why we should think of porn as a bad thing. Well, there's a wonderful quote. So Christopher Lash's book, The Culture of Narcissism, has a lot to say about pornography. And it says that what it does is it prevents us from being able to fantasize. Because what it does is it divorces sex or fantasies about sex from any connotations with real life and any connections with real lived experience. And I think there's actually a lot in that it takes an act which is meaningful for human beings because it is situated in reality, i.e. sex and sexual relations with others, and it removes it from that context. And it attempts to present it as something which can provide you with satisfaction independently of an interaction with other human beings. Not only that, it actively condones self-indulgence. It encourages you to stay in your room and jerk off when you could be going out and seeking the same satisfaction from another human being. And I think that is the role that pornography is playing in society today. It's playing into people's panic around sex and relationships. It's presenting itself as a safe option as opposed to going out and living a real sex life. It's presenting itself as a means of avoiding the inherent emotional and physical risk which is inherent in genuine sexual intercourse. And I think that what we should do is reject porn, encourage young people to reject porn, and have them going out and living their sex lives like normal and functional human beings.